All right, so today's topic is reporting crashes, how to provide the right information and understand who uses it. So before we begin, I want to have a few quick notes. First of all, we'd love to hear from you. Your experiences and your questions will help us to deliver the most impactful training. So please use chat to submit any questions and comments that you have throughout the presentations. And we will address any open questions at the end of the webinar during a Q&A session with our speaker. During the Q&A session, you can also raise your hand on Zoom if you'd like to verbally ask a question. We are recording this webinar, and we will be sending out a YouTube link to all registrants within the next week. So my colleague Shannon is going to add a link to the chat, so you should be able to look up the ITRE YouTube channel, and you can follow us there to receive updates on additional training and traffic safety content in the future. So our presenter today is Daniel Carter with NCDOT. Daniel is a traffic safety specialist and data wrangler with the North Carolina Department of Transportation. He serves in the Traffic Safety Unit, where he uses safety analysis methods to inform DOT project priorities and alternatives. His focus areas are in crash data, roadway data, and integrating these data together in a spatial environment for safety analysis. So, Daniel, we're excited to have you back on the webinar series, and I will hand the screen back over to you.
All right. Let me get everything up and rolling here. Appreciate it, Tracy. Let me know if I'm still coming across on the audio and everything.
Sounds good.
Okay, let me get the presentation up and rolling here then. All right, great. Well, thank you for the chance to talk this morning. Thank you to those attending. Appreciate you coming in to talk about crash data and how we can do it in a good way and hopefully uh, help explain who's using it. And I'm going to give my perspective and the work I do here at NCDOT. So primarily, this particular session is directed at law enforcement officers who report traffic crashes. And from looking at the registration, I think that's quite a number of you. So what I'm going to be doing here, the structure of what I'm doing is I'm going to go through specific areas of the crash report that are most important for us who are doing traffic safety analysis. And I'll kind of use that term traffic safety analysis, basically looking at crash data and figuring out ways to use that data to help us improve the roads and improve safety. So I'll discuss best practices for filling out these fields, and I'm going to give an illustration of how we use that data. And so I wanted to kind of be connecting, what you're doing to what we're doing. I think a lot of you know the flow of crash data from all the different law enforcement agencies across the state. It's all feeding up to the state crash database over at NCDMV, and then from there it goes out to maybe more places than you might have realized. I mean, it's affecting our policies, it's affecting research, national standards, where funding goes. It feeds into the strategic road safety plans, both at the city level, the MPO and RPO levels, the state level. But the one I'm going to focus in on today is how we're using it, and particularly in the engineering side of the house, to do the safety improvements that we're doing on the roadways. So I want to give you a little bit about, who I am, what we do here at the NCDOT Traffic Safety Unit. We are analyzing the crash data. We're using what you're delivering. We're using that to identify what you might call locations of concern or hot spots, areas where we need to look at for safety improvements because we're seeing some kind of crash pattern there. We do visits to these sites. We recommend improvements. We're also looking at the crash data to compile statistics to inform policies, our highway projects. And some of you will be familiar with this, how it feeds into policies at city agencies and within police departments. And then we also serve as an agency to distribute the crash data to essentially whoever needs it. And it's cities that come to us for crash data, state agencies, both inside DOT and outside other state agencies. The media is looking to us for a lot of times for crash statistics or trends. We do provide data to law enforcement. I've had a number of law enforcement agencies contact me to get, crashes in their area for the past few years or that sort of thing, and also the crime analysts that are within those agencies. And shout out to my crime analyst friends. I saw a few of you on the registration. So I think I'm trying to kind of give you this picture of how the crash data is used. And I really like to communicate it's not just for insurance. What you do has a real effect on the road safety projects that we're doing. So just to kind of illustrate a few points that I mentioned there, what we call network screenings, where we're looking at intersections and road sections across the state to identify which ones are in need of safety improvement. We're looking at patterns of crashes and that kind of thing. So this illustration here shows in Greenville some of the sites that kind of bubble to the top of, these are the sites we need to go look at. These are the sections of road that we need to look at based on the crash data that the officers have been providing to us. In diagnosis, we go and look at the site. We look at on the left side, you can see what we call a collision diagram. So showing over the past, let's say, 3 years, what have been the crashes at this particular intersection with those arrows showing the types of crashes and where they occurred in the intersection. We're looking for patterns. What things, sort of things could we correct with a safety improvement on the road? We'll review the DMV 349 crash report. We'll go out. We have staff that go out to the sites to look at the site conditions. What's the site distance like? What's the traffic control like? The curvature of the road, everything that might affect the safety of this location. Do that field review and then develop ideas for what we call countermeasures or safety improvements to the road. So if we're looking at a crash pattern, we'll see what would be a countermeasure or several countermeasures that might address that crash pattern. So for this particular instance, we have a lot of what we call angle crashes or the T-bone, the right angle crashes. We could look to slow the speeds on the major road. We could look to put in something like a flashing beacon or an enhanced stop sign. We could move it up a little bit and convert the whole thing to an all-way stop, a four-way stop control, or we can move up a lot and convert it to a roundabout or put a signal there. So there's a lot of different options that we have, and that's what we're using crash data to inform us. We also look at crash data to tell us is what we did effective. We look at a before and an after. So if this intersection, before it was a two-way stop, and we had a crash pattern. After we put a four-way stop, there was the crash pattern. It went down. This is a good thing. We're seeing that it was effective. And so that's some of the ways that we're using that crash data. And the last point I'll mention is that we also provide input on upcoming projects, highway projects, road projects across the state, and we provide input on the safety effects, certain aspects of those projects that could be done in a way that would be better for safety, to decrease crashes, to decrease injuries, that sort of thing. So I've talked about how we're, using crash data, but it all begins with a crash report. And this is, of course, where it relates directly to what you're doing, because what you collect is critical to us. As you know, I'm going to be presenting the viewpoint of us in NCDOT Traffic Safety Unit, how we're using the data, but some of the issues I'll address are common to a lot of people who use the crash data. I'm going to be primarily when I give visual examples using the actual DMV 349 crash report form. But I know that a lot of you, most of you, are entering data via vendor software, and there's several that are used across the state. I'm not going to be putting up vendor software generally for that kind of thing, but hopefully you can kind of relate to your particular software that you use. All right. So first I want to talk about location. And honestly, for my money, this is the biggest one for us. It's, of all the fields on the crash report form, and there are quite a few, to me, location fields are among the most important for what we're doing because we're trying to figure out where did the crash occur. And even that simple fact is critical to us. And it can often be difficult to determine accurately or precisely exactly where did the crash occur. And I'd like to, as I've spoken with law enforcement audiences in the past, I really like to kind of point out, both the engineering side of the house, the enforcement side of the house, we want to know where crashes happened, but I have recognized there's a bit of a difference in the precision need. A lot of times law enforcement needs to know generally where the crash is happening because we're going to, deploy some high intensity enforcement, some speed enforcement or what have you. And getting crashes sort of to the nearest block level can be okay in most of the time because it kind of dictates where you might put your enforcement. For us, we actually have a really precise need for knowing exactly where the crash happened because it matters in terms of what part of the road or which intersection we're going to improve or how we're going to improve it. So there's a big need on our side to get some good precision on exactly where the crash happened. So let's look at the crash report form and some of those fields, as I mentioned. So we've got, of course, the road names that will be called the on road there, the distance and the direction, and then the from and towards road. So we have all these fields that you're very familiar with. You feed these in, you fill those out, and those go into the state. So how do we use that? And so I'll give an example here. This crash is reported to be on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. To the right over there, let's see if I can get my mouse on the screen. It's said to be 100 feet east from Old Chapel Hill Road. Okay, so we have the indication of where this crash occurred. And in our system, just to kind of give you a little bit behind the scenes, what happens is we take that information, the system finds, okay, Martin Luther King Road is this road right here, and we have route numbers, and this particular route has that numbered ID to that route. And then it takes the other information, 100 feet east from Old Chapel Hill Road. So it looks and sees, okay, this is Old Chapel Hill Road running up and down on the left side here. Go out 100 feet to the east, and it determines this is exactly where the crash happened. And what it does is it assigns up what we call a milepost value. If you ever hear a milepost value, it's just a number, and the whole road is basically measured from zero at some end and just measured all the way down like a measuring tape. And the milepost gives us exactly where along that route the crash occurred. And so that's how we track crash positioning or locations. Now there are, I'll give you a good example of how that was translated to milepost, but we have a system, an automated system that does this, and sometimes it can't do it. Sometimes it can't provide the milepost because something in the names of the streets or the indications didn't go right. And I'll try to highlight a few of those. So how do we use this? As I mentioned, it's important to determining the crash locations and specifically in when you get into confusing locations. And so if we have this scenario here where we've got Martin Luther King there and the same location, there's a kind of a neighborhood street that comes off of that Glidewell chord. It loops back around. It's kind of U-shaped and it actually intersects Martin Luther King in two places. So if all we have to go on is that the crash occurred on Martin Luther King, 100 feet east of Glidewell, we actually have two possible locations where that could occur because Glidewell intersects two times. So this isn't really enough information for us for our system to automatically know where that crash occurred, give it the milepost, that sort of thing. But if we have a little bit more information that the crash occurred 100 feet east of Glidewell toward Donata, and that's this small neighborhood road up north here on the north side. Okay, so that actually clarifies the crash location for us because the only place where it could be east of Glidewell but toward Donata is this position. So now we've really nailed that down. So what I want to stress here is that these road names are very useful. Paying attention on the from road and the toward road is crucial for us to be able to get that crash position and not have this crash just kind of have an unknown location. We want to know where all the crashes have occurred. Sometimes we can run into situations where the information was reported that the crash was on Martin Luther King, 100 feet east of Glidewell toward Old Chapel Hill. So now we have some contradictory information because either of these Glidewell intersections, if you go east from them, that's not toward Old Chapel Hill. That's over here to the west of it. So we have contradictory information. This happens. I mean, we're all people. Something got entered incorrectly, either the direction or the toward road or something. But in this case, we would have to go look at the sketch or the diagram and the narrative to actually figure out exactly where this crash happened. Another one I wanted to highlight in terms of location is the on-road class. And so this is and of course your interface, depending on what software you're using, will differ. But there's a place when you're saying which road the crash occurred on to indicate what the class of that road is. And I've given just kind of the rundown there from the 349 instructions on the different codes that you might be able to put in. And this actually does play into some important things for us in terms of determining where the crash occurred, generally speaking. Was it on a road or was it in a parking lot? So for example, we have this crash here where it's said to occur on PVA 7900 Briar Creek Parkway. So that's kind of putting together the road class and the name or the route number of the road. And it's clearly labeled as occurring in a PVA. We can, if and just to give you the backdrop on that, we typically do not include parking lot PVA crashes in our safety analysis. When we're trying to figure out what to do to the road, to the intersections, we're not including crashes occurring in parking lots. I mean, obviously those can be bad and you can have injuries in parking lots, but for our purview, it's just typically not something that we're looking at. And so we are interested in on a broad scale basis, filtering out PVA crashes from what we're trying to compile, from the hundreds of crashes we're trying to compile for some particular location. So this crash would be able to be excluded pretty automatically. It's got the PVA labeling there in the crash, the road class. But Here's another crash where it's said to be on 620 Glenwood Avenue. So I'm kind of left wondering, did this crash occur in a PVA? Was it some kind of parking lot at that address? Or is the officer just kind of providing like the address of sort of where on Glenwood it occurred? It's a little bit unclear. So we go to the sketch, the diagram. We see this. Okay, it's a parking lot crash. So we can do that, but it takes time. And what we'd like is to be able to move through all the crashes that we have to analyze to be able to get the answer to the party who needs it, to the road improvement that's underway, that sort of thing. So that's what I kind of wanted to stress here is use that on-road class correctly so that we can filter those out and know exactly what roads were involved there. Uh, the other thing that's on the form, I'm sure you've encountered, at least seen, is the latitude longitude fields, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I specifically am not including altitude in that, and to my knowledge, we have never used altitude for a safety analysis. So if you've been filling out altitude, thank you, but you can stop now. So let's talk about lat long. So these are the two numbers that can provide a very clear indication of where the crash occurred. I've talked about how we use road names and the directions from the different roads, but this kind of information can be very clear and can be very precise about where the crash occurred. We have, thankfully, a good number of agencies across the state who are already collecting lat-long coordinates on most or all crashes. And so I'm kind of providing you a good list here of the ones who are doing it. And really, most of these are providing it for 95% or more of their crashes. So big thank you from us to all of you in these departments. We really appreciate that. That's giving us a lot of good data and a lot of good location data on these crashes. The best approach, and if I could recommend the best approach here, is that the officer on the scene is recording those lat-long coordinates on the crash report form, rather than someone doing it after the fact, someone trying to read the crash report form and figure out where the lat and long is. Officer on the scene is the best approach. And why is that? Well, it's going to eliminate a lot of these locating issues, those ones I talked about where you had the loop road situation, some of the confusion on that. It is quick to collect. And from the officers I've spoken to who are doing this, you're looking at 30 to 45 seconds. And I'll show you a web map tool that we have put into place specifically for law enforcement to use in this scenario. And so getting these coordinates, being able to locate crashes enables on my side of the house, the engineers, but also crime analysts in your agencies to be able to create crash maps, something that up until now has been difficult, especially for agencies that don't collect coordinates. Crime analysts have typically had a lot of manual effort involved in making a crash map, to report out to the chief or whoever. And the officer on the scene really, you know, when you're on the scene, you have the best knowledge of where that crash occurred. Anyone coming behind you trying to read the report has to interpret where the crash occurred, but you know exactly where the crash occurred. So you can click on the map specifically and get that lat long coordinate. As I mentioned, we've got a simple web page for this purpose. Um, Tracy will be posting this presentation and sending it out afterwards. Please do use that and go. If you haven't visited this site, it's a very simple interface. What you can do is you can go to that map, scroll into it, or search basically the kind of same interface that you would have on like a Google Maps, and you can click on the map exactly where the crash occurred. For instance, I've clicked, there on that side of Martin Luther King, just off the intersection, is exactly where the crash occurred. And precision matters. Exactly, where the crash occurred matters when we're trying to figure out what particular piece of the road needs some attention, needs to maybe be fixed or have a safety improvement. Once you've clicked on the map up in the top right-hand corner, it will display the latitude and longitude of where you've clicked. And one of the features we put into this was a copy button. So a lot of you are doing your crash reporting on, some software. So you can go and click that copy button to copy into your clipboard, copy the latitude number, and then go to whatever software you're using, click in the cell and hit Control V or paste it in there, and then do the same thing for the longitude. So you're not typing in digits, you're not, trying to keep track of numbers. You can just do it very quickly. And again, this is why it takes a very short amount of time to do this. I wanted to also mention all decimal places are needed. When you deal with latitude, longitude, just doing it to one decimal place or two decimal places, it's not precise enough. That gets that gets you within something of maybe 1 to 2,000 feet from where the crash occurred. But we really want to get specifically, 5 or 6 digits there so we can get exactly where that crash occurred. So that's just a note. But this is an easy tool for you to use. It's again geared exactly for what you're doing. So, um, how do we use the crash coordinates when you're collecting that latitude and longitude? I've got an illustration here out of Conover. So, town of Conover, kind of in the area where Hickory is, has a particular street naming scheme similar to Hickory that is difficult for our crash system, where it's based a lot on suffixes. So you have First Street, Avenue Southwest, and that kind of thing. It's very confusing to the system, and so when we try to map crashes in Conover based on road names only, it looks like the one on the left, and we don't see a lot because a lot of the crashes couldn't be put on the map. They didn't get that milepost that I referred to earlier that I showed you. But Conover has been collecting the police department there has been collecting lat-long coordinates on their crashes for at the time when I put this illustration together 3 years, but it's been several years since then. And if we map crashes using those lat-long coordinates, we see on the right what the situation actually looks like, where those crashes are occurring. And my hat's off to Conover. Good job on collecting very precise coordinates of where those crashes occurred on the road, near the intersections, that kind of thing. And so we can see a very different picture, and that can guide us to know that, oh, those intersections right there may need some attention. Those maybe we've got some crash patterns, that kind of thing. So again, better data is leading to better solutions for the real world problems that are out there. So I'm going to take a pause here because I'm going to ask if Officer Jeremy Wint is on the line. He was possibly going to be available and speak, but he wasn't quite sure. So I just want to take a brief pause. I don't think I see him. And Tracy, do we have Officer Wint on the line?
I don't see him either.
Okay. All right. It was a possible chance. So Officer Wint is part of the Hickory Police Department and has been for the past, I think, at least a half a year, maybe a full year now, collecting lat-long coordinates on the crash report forms. And we were talking recently, and he was telling me that it was pretty easy to do. I said, hey, would you be willing to come say that on the webinar, talk a little bit about your experience? And so he had some things that were going on, so he won't be able to attend today. All right, let's look at some of the other areas on the field, on the crash report form, some other fields that are particularly useful to what we're doing and particularly important. So I want to talk about injury status. This is what it looks like on the form, but basically where you're listing what injury each person, each party in the crash sustained. And so you're familiar with that scale, kind of 1 through 5, or KABCO, our CABCO scale, 1 being killed. But I know that some of the difficulty arises when you're trying to indicate what level of injury the person has, and fully recognizing this is a hard thing to do. And I just wanted to point out that it's been a number of years. It was around 2016, 2017, when some more precise language was provided about how do you actually assess the injury level. And so if you haven't, I'm putting up the wording that's provided in the instruction manual about how do you actually code this field, and it gives some more specific types of things: severe lacerations, broken extremities, crush injuries, this kind of thing that you can use to determine exactly what is the injury level. So there's the what we call the A injury, or the suspected serious injury. Moving kind of down the scale, suspected minor injury B, looking at evident injuries that are not the serious type that were listed before, so lumps on the head or some bruises or abrasions. Number 4, with the possible injuries, basically someone reporting injury, but it's not very evident, and then no injury or unknown. So I don't have a whole lot to say about how you should do this. It's obviously a difficult thing to do on the scene, but thank you for the attention that you put to it. But I want to give you a little bit about how do we use that, and where does that go? Why are you providing that kind of information about the level of the injury? Well, what we call the crash severity, which is what we term to be the highest level injury in the crash, is a big factor in our decisions. It affects where we consider to be the priority locations. If we have a lot of crashes in one place, but they are all what we call PDO, property damage only, there's no injury, that's going to weigh differently than if we have a lot of crashes in some place that are all B and A level injuries. That's going to make a big difference in which one we consider to be the priority. It also affects what kind of safety treatments we're looking at to know what kinds of crashes are occurring and how severe they're being, and what kind of injuries are occurring makes a big difference. Also, in our traffic safety unit, we have a fatal crash program. So we're looking at fatal crashes specifically. That we distribute summaries of those fatal crashes, and a number of you might get that email coming out several times per week. We also do in-depth investigations for many of the fatal crashes to determine what were the factors that went into that, and to determine from our side of things on the engineering what could be done. Is there a safety improvement that would make sense in that particular location? And then from the federal side, we do report to the federal entities on specifically our fatalities and serious injuries. This is the emphasis. This is our target here. Moving on to non-motorist crashes. And so this is a particular set of crashes that's important to us and to other parties. So we're talking about a crash that involves, pedestrian, a bicyclist, or someone else who's not a motorist, maybe on a scooter or on a wheelchair, these other types of conveyances that are non-motorized. This is an important subset of crashes to a lot of folks, like I mentioned. But I want to acknowledge that the design of our crash report form does make it difficult to identify the non-motorist crashes. And I'll show you, and you're probably familiar with some of this. I'll show you why. It's essentially because a pedestrian crash or these other non-motorist crashes can be identified in three different places, which makes it a little tough to kind of sometimes track which ones are the non-motorist crashes. So we've got the person type. Field 22 there has codings for person type being pedestrian or pedal cyclist, roller skater, rollerblader, other. So that's one place where we can identify these non-motorist crashes. There's also a place in those unit boxes for vehicle style or type, and under those there's coding for either a pedal cycle is what it's termed there, or a pedestrian. And then also in the most harmful event, or those kind of contributing factor harmful event type fields, there is coding for a pedestrian crash or a pedal cyclist crash. Um, I do want to just basically acknowledge they're the three places. And so when we are trying to look through all the crashes, the 300,000 plus crashes that come in every year, we're trying to determine which ones of these involve non-motorists, because it's an important thing for a lot of agencies. And we do have to kind of look across these three different fields. So I understand there's sometimes things at play where you have to indicate in one place or another, but just to let you know, we are looking at this and we're trying to use that information to determine these crashes so that we can do better and more investigation of them. One of the things that we're doing is actually geolocating or putting the lat long coordinates on every non-motorist crash. And if it's not reported from the officer, we're actually going in and looking at the crash report, looking at the map, and figuring out exactly where that crash occurred, so that we can have a complete data set of those crashes. This aids us in identifying those high priority locations. If you mentioned the term I use, network screening. So just showing a little piece of Greensboro here, and the most recent analysis we've done to identify the hotspots or the high priority locations for pedestrian and bicycle crashes there in the city. We also, again, kind of referring to the federal reporting, they have us report also on our ped bike, our non-motorist crashes. That's a big thing we report on. Leads to things like our vulnerable road user assessment, which is another term for the non-motorists, is the vulnerable road users. So there's a lot of attention paid to this. We do a lot of work to figure out which ones are these non-motorist crashes. So just to let you know that those fields you're filling out are directly affecting how we can find these crashes and make sure that we're addressing them well. We also disseminate the information about, particularly here, I'm kind of using the term ped bike crashes, and I've got the URL embedded at the bottom. So when you get this, if you want to visit that, or if you're really good at looking and typing things in, you can do it right now. It's a dashboard we put together to summarize what are the trends in the pedestrian or the bicyclist crashes, some of the most common crash types. And again, it's something that a lot of people are using. So thank you for the data that you're providing on that. Let's talk a little bit here about the crash diagram and narrative. So this is a very useful piece that you're providing to us. So the description, the details of that crash scene are very useful. And I want to make a point here in the narrative that that when you're doing that, you really want to withhold any kind of personal identifying information like names, addresses really shouldn't be included there. And a little note that when the crash form is revised, actually next year, so 2026, there will be a separate field, a separate space for names and addresses. It'll be right under the narrative or wherever it is in your crash reporting software. But there'll be a place specifically for that because I know that's a difficulty right now with some of the situations you run into, like hit and run or that sort of thing. So from the 349 instructions, there's some guidance on what kinds of things should you include here, and it's all good. Roads and intersecting roads, shoulders and median strips, so you get some of the roadway kind of stuff. The travel lanes and their directions, features out there, and of course the paths of travel of the parties involved. And you guys do a great job on this, showing the vehicles involved or the pedestrians and bicycles, where they came from, which way were they going. All very, very helpful. Measurements, north arrow, very important thing. Oddly, you wouldn't think so, but north arrow is really actually very important when we're trying to decipher, sometimes in confusing situations, exactly where the crash happened. That's actually really useful. And I wanted to call out a few other things that are important in my world, in our world, where we're doing safety analysis and trying to use the crash diagram and narrative for certain things. Um, Turn arrows on the pavement is actually something that's really helpful to us to know that, okay, this was on this intersection approach where I can see these left turn arrows, and so this must be where this crash occurred. Um, Road names, when you put the road names on there, it's super useful for clarifying, oh, I see, okay, it was on Main Street here, just off of Green Street, that kind of thing. A lot of times you might include landmarks like the restaurant that's nearby or a church that's nearby. This is also really useful to us, just as a confirmation sometimes of, oh, yes, okay, the crash occurred right here. We see that, this particular Popeyes or Chick-fil-A or something, the Walmart's here. We see that on the diagram. Okay, we can confirm it's here. And then things like hardware, roadside hardware, like guardrails, very useful to us, both in determining where the crash occurred. Oh, I can see the officer says they impacted the guardrail, or they're showing the guardrail in the picture, so we know it occurred here on this piece of road, and we know that that guardrail probably needs some attention. So, how do we use? I'll just kind of illustrate a few ways that we use the diagram and the narrative. So, got a crash here that the officer says was recorded to be on SR 1239, 0 miles from SR 1239 toward SR 1383. So it's a bit unclear that it's on 1239 at 1239. So we would have to go in that case to the diagram and narrative, look at the crash report form. And when we do that, we can see, oh, because the road name's on the diagram, I can actually see it's at the intersection of 1239 and US 258. So, and it's also, if you read the narrative, it confirms that as well. It mentions 258. So this helped in this particular situation. It helped the analyst go, okay, I know that this crash occurred at this particular intersection, and be able to move on and do the analysis from there. So that's one way that we're using it. But obviously, we'd like to try to avoid this because looking at sketches and narratives is time consuming. The other thing, another thing that we use the narrative for is to identify really specific kinds of crashes that there's no box for, there's no field for on the form. This one actually I pulled from something I did just a few weeks ago where uh, my boss asked me to do an analysis about construction workers being struck in work zones, and we don't have a box for that. So I had to read the narratives, do some keyword searches, and when I see something like this that says the driver of vehicle one was driving careless and struck a construction worker in the roadway, I can say, okay, yes, this is one of the crashes. This is one of the target crashes that I'm supposed to be compiling. I'm going to check yes on this one. This is part of what I'm looking for. So this is another instance where we look at the words that you're providing. They are very, very useful. I can think of other things we've done where very specific requests come our way about maybe folks in wheelchairs who were involved in a crash. And so I'm looking for the word wheelchair in the narrative, that kind of thing. So just to recap, bottom line here, what you're recording on the crash report form makes a real difference in how we're seeing what are the problems on the roadway and what can we do. Your data is the primary guidance to preventing future crashes. Again, for us, for we who are working to implement safety improvements, it's our primary guidance. So again, it's useful for insurance, but it's not just for insurance. And those important data fields I covered, location, hugely important. If we can figure out where the crash occurred, that's huge for us. Injury status, identifying non-motorist crashes, and also the crash diagram and narrative, all very important. I hope that what I've done is to provide you some illustration of how we're using that and why it's important. And the last point I'll leave you with, the latitude and longitude. If you've heard me talk before, you know I push this because I do have a lot of uh, belief that this is going to really help us with the locational aspects. Thank you to those of you who are doing it. Um, if you haven't, please do visit our lat long map there. It's that kind of Google Map type tool that you can use to quickly get the lat and long, put that into your crash report form. So thank you for your attention today. I want to put my contact information here. I really would love to have any kind of conversations you want to have about crash data. If you're interested in collecting the lat and long and you haven't tried that yet, I'd be happy to talk you through it. Very easy to do. So give me a call, shoot me an email, dlcarter4@ncdot.gov. Love to talk with you. So that's what I've got for you. And I know that Tracy's been sort of compiling any questions that have come in, but if you've got any questions that you want to put forward, please do use the chat. And Tracy, you can give a little guidance on how they would do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. Excellent presentation. I learned a lot. So we are now going to open it up for discussion for any questions. We do have some in the Q&A, and I've also received a few that were submitted earlier by email. So I'm going to first start with a couple that we've already received. So one, how do we confirm that crash reports from law enforcement agencies not listed are being inputted into the overall database? And I think this was inputted in one of your earliest slides.
Is it referring to the list of agencies that had that were reporting lat long coordinates? I know I've kind of put up a big list of agencies there.
Yeah, it was before that, but if this person would be happy to provide some additional context, please do enter that into the chat or in the Q&A.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
I may not be quite understanding the question, so if you could clarify, that would be awesome.
We will come back to that one if we get some more clarification. Shannon, could you tell us one of the ones that was submitted through email?
Sure. One of the questions was, how can the definition of a reportable crash be expanded to include crashes not on a public road? For example, a driver that crashes into a building or into a person in a parking lot.
Yeah, those crashes are reported. Now, if it's you're talking about required to be reported, I'm not the one to speak to necessarily about that. That's going to be more of the DMV side of things. But yeah, a number of crashes that parking lots or other things that occur, especially resulting in injuries, are reported to the crash database, and we do use those. Again, I'm not always looking at the parking lot crashes because our particular purview is the roadway. So that's what I'm looking at.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. And we did get clarification. That earlier question was specifically referring to Union County Sheriff's Department. So,
Okay, that may be a question of the transmission of the crash report data up to NCDMV. I'm guessing maybe the question is about that. So I'm going to have to ask you to talk to your DMV contact, whoever is part of that chain of data transmission, going to DMV. That's going to be the question, and I appreciate you asking that question because sometimes things do get hung up and the data is not transmitting. So please do look into that. That would be excellent.
great, thank you. Um, is there any data on electric bike versus regular bike crashes, bicycle, specifically in Rutherford County?
Yeah, this is a really good question because it's highlighting one of those things, like I mentioned, where we just don't have a box for it, at least yet. We don't have a particular code on the current form for doing that. So if I was asked to pull together the list of crashes that involved e-bikes, maybe in Rutherford County, um, I'd have to go to the narrative probably to see if the officer talked about it being an e-bike. I honestly don't know if an officer would necessarily identify a bicyclist as being an e-bike. I know when I've seen them, it's basically like a thicker cross member on the bike. It's a bit hard to tell. So that'd be a really tough one to crack, a tough one to pull together data on. But it's a good information, or it's a good emphasis on providing as much detail in the narrative as possible on things like that, so that if the question comes up, we can at least try to take a stab at answering it.
Okay, thank you. Is there any movement toward adding to the crash report distracted driving as a predecessor to a crash?
Uh, yeah, there are fields. I mean, there are codes that deal with distracted types of contributing factors on there. So maybe that answers the question. I don't know that it's going to be necessarily a its own field, but there are codes that talk about driver contributing circumstances and things that would involve distraction, things like that.
Okay. Shannon, could you go ahead and tell us the second question that was submitted by email?
Sure. The second question is, it seems like crash reports can be altered after being filed without a notation of the alteration or why it was changed. This can retroactively change all reported data. How can we ensure that the integrity of reported, how can we ensure the integrity of reported data when it can be altered? So how can post hoc alterations be documented?
Okay, so I think what you're referring to is the fact that there can be an initial submittal of a crash report, and then at some point after that, there can be a revised submission or a supplemental that's done to maybe correct a piece of data on there or add a piece of data. It may be that the sergeant in charge has kicked it back to the officer to say, hey, you know, you need to add this thing on there or correct this, or it may come back all the way from NCDMV to say, you know, this particular thing is needs to be addressed, and so you know, supplemental reports filed. Um, I think what the gist of your question is how can that sort of be maybe tracked or linked together? It's a good question. I know that you can kind of pull up the initial submittal and the revised submittal, and if you know if you want to compare those. Beyond that, you're gonna be looking kind of more of a database structure, look at the data, you know, to see when it was last updated. And I don't know that there's a lot of. I haven't actually tried to see, you know, can you tell what field was changed? And maybe there's a better answer out there that I'm giving. It's just not something I've tried to do before. So I apologize. I can't speak extremely well to that.
Thank you. And if there are follow-up questions to any of these, again, enter it into the chat. We'll try to cover them all. All right. Additional questions. Does the state have geolocated crash data available to the public beyond what's offered in the summarized safety data maps? I would be interested in point data for use in GIS.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very reasonable question to ask, because I think a lot of times it's sort of to the general public. I mean, why aren't we putting out just kind of like a map of all crashes in the state, right? Let's just put the point map out there of all the crashes. Um, I mentioned it, didn't go real heavy into it, but I think that gave enough indications that some crashes don't get located automatically by our system. And I talked about some of the issues with maybe the loop that U road, you know, where it intersections confusing, or the different types of information, the contradictory information that was entered, and so the system couldn't figure out where the crash was. So we end up having about 10% of our crashes that we can't make a point on the map in an automated fashion. It would take a manual effort, and that's a lot of crashes, and we don't have that much manual effort. So we don't put out a statewide crash map because it wouldn't include every crash is part of the issue there. We would have 10% of crashes that aren't located. They wouldn't be part of that. And we just don't want to put out a partial data set and have some implication that it's all the crashes. And so what you're referring to, our safety data maps, are those subsets of crashes like the ped bike, the non-motorist crashes, where we have put the specific effort into geolocating each and every one of those high quality map, and we can put that out there. We do feel that that's the 100%, but we can't do it for all of them yet. We are moving toward trying to get better data and procedures to be able to geolocate and put points on the map for all the crashes. And I'll take this as an opportunity to push, get me those lat longs, and I can do a lot better with that. So if you can collect those lat long coordinates, we can really raise our percentage of how many crashes we can map and move, hopefully to really close to 100% in the future.
That's great. Thank you. And I appreciate the comment. I've been told that chat is disabled, so I apologize. If anyone has questions,
Hmm.
please use the Q&A. The Q&A box will also respond to comments in there. And thank you for letting me know about that. Okay, another question. Are law enforcement officers required to include demographic data, such as age, race, etc.?
That yeah, so the fields are there on the forms, and I don't know if those are required. I don't have a great mental list of every, you know, which fields are required and which fields are optional. So I'm sorry I can't speak to that one. It is commonly filled out if that helps.
Sure.
I don't know if it's required though.
Okay. Thank you. Are lat long coordinates showing where the crash occurred or where the crash was located when first responders arrive?
That's a good question. And this sometimes comes up where you have someone who ran off the road, traveled for 100 feet, and then impacted a tree or a culvert or something like that. Because that's the situation where, and I've had this question put to me by highway patrol troopers. Um, and really what we want to know is where did the, again, this is my viewpoint, right? This is NCDOT viewpoint here. Where did it happen on the roadway? We are concerned with the roadway. We also do want to know things like hitting the culvert or the tree or whatever it is. That's maybe going to be something that we look at more specifically when we go check out that area. We pull those 50 crashes together, whatever is happening out there, and look at them specifically. Go do the field visit. We'll look at that kind of thing. But typically, we want to know where did the crash happen or start? And I know that can be kind of vague sometimes, so we'll rely on your judgment about where on the roadway did this crash essentially happen? Where was the impact, or where did the person leave the road, or where did the problem occur? Not necessarily where was the final resting place of the vehicle, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it is one of those things. It's going to be a little bit of a judgment on your part. It's a lot more clear when two vehicles just collide in an intersection. That's obviously where it occurred. A little harder when there's maybe some distance being traveled. But great question and a really good thing to think about.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions related to sheriff's offices in rural areas. So maybe you could just talk for a little bit about how DOT is potentially reaching out to get more sheriff's offices involved with maybe the lat long coordinates, but also we had a question related to the crash report in terms of sheriff's offices. So do you have any comments there?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've dealt with law enforcement agencies and dealing with crash data, I don't know that I would necessarily draw any kind of distinction between sheriff's offices and other local law enforcement or even the highway patrol. I mean, essentially everyone is using the same crash report form. Now the software may differ, and I apologize, I don't know exactly how all the sheriff's offices might be doing things. I haven't had as much interaction with sheriff's offices. But I mean, really, the kind of stuff I covered is applicable to any reporting officer, whether from sheriff's office or a city police department or anything like that. So I don't know if there's maybe more specificity there, Tracy, in some of those questions.
Um, we just got questions like, are you reaching out to more rural areas? Someone didn't see any sheriff's offices listed as providing lat long details. So,
Yeah, that's true. And it's something I have been trying to do is to reach out to law enforcement agencies. There are a lot of them, and not that many of us. And so opportunities like this webinar is a place where I can try to get the word out. Um, but yeah, we ideally would love to have everyone on board. It just takes a while to kind of get to everyone. So certainly, if you're with the sheriff's office and would like to talk about this, I would love it because again, I haven't had that much interaction with those of you in the sheriff's offices.
that's great. And yes, I would like to add to that if anyone on this webinar has ideas or suggestions for how to continue to spread the word, put them in the Q&A. We'll record that. We'll follow up as best as we can. Um, all right, a question here. Do we know if the update to the DMV 349 in 2026 will include golf carts or low-speed vehicles?
Oh, there will be revisions to vehicle types, vehicle styles, vehicle uses. I would have to go look at the list of the proposed revisions to see if it gets specific on like golf carts. And if there's anyone from NCDMV or my other DOT colleagues that knows more about that, wants to pop that into Tracy, please do. I don't know off the top of my head though. But there will be changes on those specific fields, vehicle uses and vehicle styles, to try to capture more of this kind of thing, more specificity.
Sure. And it sounds like it's also an opportunity. We can host another training when that change does come so that everyone is aware of the changes. So we'll keep
Yes, there will certainly be training when the new form is rolled out. When we get to 2026, you will probably be having training from your vendor if you're part of a vendor software. Also, NCDMV will probably be doing some training and that sort of thing. Yeah, and then also I'd be happy to have any interaction at that point.
great. All right. Are there any considerations to include a block on the crash report to capture secondary crashes?
There actually will be more added about capturing secondary crashes on the revision to the 349 coming in 2026.
Okay, thank you. Can you clarify, are all law enforcement agencies, including sheriff's offices, required to report to you?
There are specific requirements about which crashes shall be reported, not to me, but to NCDMV up to the state level at DMV. And that applies to any crash reporting agency. There are certain criteria if the crash results in a fatality or an injury or property damage over $1,000. These are the kind of thresholds that say, yeah, this crash must be reported. And there are some other pieces of the language there that says it has to involve, a motor vehicle in motion, which does present to us some holes in our data. If we have a pedestrian struck by a train, it's technically not required to be reported because it wasn't a motor vehicle that was in motion. These are crashes that, of course, you can report, but if you talk about the requirement, it doesn't meet the requirement of what needs to be reported. So there's a difference in there between crashes you can send a crash report in for and ones that you have to send a crash report in for.
Understood. Thank you. Um, so this person would like some more clarification between using state secondary routes versus local street names. He said that he teaches officers to use, I'm assuming, secondary street routes as opposed to the local names when entering reference streets. Can you confirm if this is correct?
Um, that's perfectly fine. We can work with either one.
Okay.
Um, if you had to lean one way, yeah, I like using the secondary route numbers. And a lot of times you find that a particular road, if it's a state road, will have a secondary route number. So you might have SR 1239, also called Green Street. We can work with either one. Our system can handle either one of those. If I lean one way, maybe getting the number, as long as the number gets put in correctly, not mistyped or whatever. But yeah, either one really we can handle.
Okay.
Also, if you get us coordinates, we don't have to rely solely on street names.
We should make t-shirts. That long. We love that long.
That's right.
Let's see. I want to make sure we've answered everything. I do want to call out, thank you, Todd. We did get a comment. We at the Division would like to bring attention to the railroad crossing number field where crashes involved a train, equipment, or impact at the crossing surface. So these numbers are found at the blue sign at railroad crossings. It says emergency notification system, and to make sure to call the emergency number. Oh, I lost it. Here it goes. Emergency number on the sign immediately. So I think we just wanted to make sure everyone on the call is aware of that blue sign. If it's involved with a rail incident, some kind of crash, look for that blue sign. So thank you, Todd, for bringing that to our attention. And let me just see. Oh, we got another one. Would the estimated damage dollar amount be removed from the new report? It seems in my experience, officers have little to no training in this, and only external damage may be visible.
I think it's still on there. Again, I've been part of the revision process for the 349, but it's not in my memory as far as every field. Now, I'm pretty sure it's still on there. And honestly, I just like to acknowledge that that's a tough thing to do to provide. I mean, I think even some mechanics would be in a tough spot to provide a on the scene evaluation of yeah, that's $2,000 worth of damage. So do your best. We understand that that's not a super precise estimate that you're giving.
Okay, thank you. So I believe I've addressed everything in the Q&A. I'm going to share my screen if anyone would like to raise your hand if you would like to verbally ask a question, or feel free to, again, add it to the chat. And we will follow up with anything that's not answered live here. So I want to thank Daniel again. This has been a great discussion. And to everyone who has joined us for this webinar. Our team at ITRE provides traffic safety training and outreach materials throughout the year, so including webinars like this one. We also provide free social media content additional in-person training, and of course, the North Carolina Traffic Safety Conference. So I invite you to stay up to date with all of those resources. You can follow the links here, scan the QR codes to receive those emails for upcoming events and new resources. So I want to thank you all for what you are doing to keep our roads safe, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you all.